Ascendancy, Episode 9, Reckoning. Earth's orbital defense network, built up over decades into something considerably more capable than the modest planetary shield the Order had once departed beneath, tracked the 6 approaching vessels for 11 tense hours before the Great Council's emergency session finally authorized contact rather than interception. 11 hours in which Ava Brennan, woken from sleep by a call she would remember for the rest of her considerably extended life, sat in the archive's small monitoring room with Aveline Vance and Juno Vance on either side of her, watching a blip on a display resolve with excruciating slowness into 6 ships that could only be one thing. It could be a different fleet entirely, Juno said carefully, watching Ava's hands, folded tightly in her lap, betray a tremor her voice was working hard not to. A trade delegation, a scouting party. I do not want you to build the whole of your hope around a single reading before we know for certain. I know exactly what it is, Juno, Ava said. I have spent 14 years learning the specific shape of hoping for this exact thing. I am not going to pretend, in the final hour of the wait, that I do not recognize it simply because recognizing it terrifies me. The Council's official first contact, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic in its formality. A diplomatic hail, answered within seconds by a voice the archive's oldest recordings confirmed within minutes belonged, unmistakably, to Kael, requesting immediate audience with the Great Council on a matter he described, with characteristic restraint, as considerably more urgent than our absence might have led this council to expect. News of the fleet's return spread through Earth's networks within the hour, and the reaction, even before a single ship had landed, told Kael everything he would spend the following weeks confirming in person, that 14 years had not settled Earth's feelings about the Order into anything as simple as either welcome or resentment, but into something considerably messier, made of both at once, depending entirely on who was asked and what that particular life had cost them in the departure's long aftermath. Crowds gathered outside the Council's public plazas within hours, some carrying old departure-era banners rescued from storage, faded messages of love and gratitude toward a people some of them had never personally known, others carrying signs considerably less welcoming, the specific bitterness of a generation raised on stories of a population crisis they blamed, fairly or not, on a species that had loved humanity enough to leave and not quite enough, in their accounting, to stay and fix what its presence had broken. Kael watched the footage from the shuttle's final approach, standing beside Threndel in a silence neither of them quite knew how to fill. I did not expect unanimous welcome, Threndel said. I find I am still unprepared for the specific shape unwelcome has apparently taken. I do not know how to hold both crowds as equally legitimate, Kael, and I suspect we do not have the luxury of choosing only to believe the kinder one. No, Kael agreed. We do not. I intend to try anyway. He found both crowds waiting, in person, when the Council finally permitted a brief public appearance outside the chamber 3 days after the fleet's landing. A wide plaza divided, almost too neatly for comfort, into 2 distinct masses, separated by a thin cordon of security personnel, who looked considerably more uncertain of their task than either side of the crowd did. On one side, people reached toward him with an open, unguarded joy that reminded him achingly of the departure ceremony 14 years earlier, several of them holding faded photographs of relatives who had loved someone from the Order and never stopped grieving the goodbye. On the other, signs bearing messages considerably harder to read without flinching. You left us to die alone, and welcome back. Now fix what you broke. Held by people whose anger, Kael understood even as it struck him, was never really about him personally so much as about every hard year Earth had spent clawing its way back from a decline his own kind had unintentionally caused, simply by being loved too well. He stopped at the cordon's edge, rather than proceeding directly to the security vehicle, waiting to receive him, to the visible alarm of his escort, and addressed the harder crowd directly, rather than avoiding it. I do not have a way to undo what our presence cost you, he told them, his voice carrying across the plaza's sudden, startled hush. I do not think there is a version of this reunion honest enough to pretend otherwise. I can only tell you that I have spent 8 years watching my own people pay a considerably steeper price for choices we made trying to spare you further cost, and I have come home not to ask you to forgive the past, but to ask whether both of us might be willing to build something better than either version of the story we have been telling ourselves apart. I do not expect that request to erase your anger today. I would only ask you not to let it go unanswered. It did not resolve the plaza's anger, not that day and not for many days afterward, but it was, several council aides told him quietly in the hours that followed, the first thing any council session's carefully worded statements had failed to accomplish in 3 days of trying, and it left him, walking back into the chamber, with the specific, hard-won understanding that whatever reconciliation was actually possible between their two peoples was going to have to be built one uncomfortable, honest conversation at a time, rather than granted all at once by a single, grateful crowd. The reunion itself happened not in the Great Council's formal chamber, but in the modest landing bay, where the fleet's shuttle finally touched down, because Ava Brennan, informed of the timeline, had refused every official protocol suggesting she wait for a scheduled ceremonial greeting. "I have waited 14 years, she told the junior aide, who tried, gently, to explain the security procedures. "I'm not going to wait one additional hour past the moment his feet touch this ground, so that a camera crew can be properly positioned. You may inform the council I said so." She was there when the shuttle's ramp lowered, standing with Aveline Vance's steadying arm beneath her own, though she barely seemed to need it, and Kael, stepping down onto Earth's soil for the first time in 14 years, found the whole of the speech he had spent 6 years and 8 months composing in his mind entirely deserting him the moment he saw her. "You are older," he said, which was not remotely what he had meant to say first, and which made her laugh, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, the first sound either of them had shared in person in 14 years. "You are astonishingly exactly the same," she answered. "I have thought about this moment for so long, Kael, and prepared so many things to say, and I find I have nothing at all except that I am so glad, so entirely and completely glad, that you are standing here in front of me instead of 6 years away in a letter." She reached for him, and he closed the remaining distance in a single step, and the embrace that followed held 14 years of careful, patient letters, and every word neither of them had ever quite managed to fit into them. "I am sorry," he said into her hair, his voice unsteady in a way he made no attempt to hide. "I am sorry it has been this long, and I am sorry about the reason I am finally standing here, and I am sorry, more than anything else, for every year this war has already cost people I loved before I ever found the courage to ask you for help." "You are here now," Ava said. "That is the only part of this I intend to hold on to today. Tell me everything, Kael, all of it. I have spent 14 years ready to hear it." Juno and Aveline Vance stood back through the whole of it, giving the two of them what privacy a landing bay full of security personnel could offer. And it was Juno who finally stepped forward once the first overwhelming moment had passed, embracing Kael with the easy warmth of someone who had spent decades in his absence, keeping every promise she had ever made to remain close to the people who loved him. "Marcus asked about you until the end," she told him quietly. "He never stopped believing you would come back through that door eventually. I only wish he had lived to see it himself." "I am sorry I was not here for that," Kael said, and meant it entirely, a fresh grief settling alongside the joy of the reunion in the specific, complicated way he was beginning to understand simply came with loving a species that did not have the luxury of waiting for him indefinitely. That evening, once the day's formal obligations had finally released them, Kael sat with Ava in the same small study where he had once, over a century of her life ago in relative terms, taken his first embodied steps. The room unchanged in every way that mattered, though the woman sitting across from him in it had lived an entire additional lifetime since he had last shared it with her. "I am frightened of something I did not expect to be frightened of, now that you are finally here," Ava admitted, watching him with the same searching honesty she had brought to every difficult conversation they had ever had. "I spent 14 years afraid I would lose you to the distance, or to the war, or simply to time doing what time does, to things left unattended. I find, now that you are sitting across from me again, that I am afraid of something smaller and considerably more selfish. I am 102, Kael. I do not know how many more years even the best medicine available to me can reasonably promise. I do not want to have gotten you back, only to spend whatever time remains grieving the fact that I will eventually have to leave you again, permanently, in a way no letter across any distance will ever be able to reach." "Then let us not spend the time we do have grieving something that has not happened yet," Kael said, taking her hand, older and thinner now than the hand he remembered, but no less entirely hers. "I have learned considerably more than I ever wanted to about loss these past 8 years, Ava. I have learned that grieving in advance does not lessen the eventual cost. It simply steals joy from every day that was never actually guaranteed to either of us in the first place. I would rather spend whatever time we have left building something extraordinary together, the way we always have, than spend a single evening of it in mourning for a day that has not yet arrived." "That," Ava said, something bright breaking through the fear in her expression, "is precisely the kind of sentence you were always considerably better at composing than I was. I have missed that specific talent of yours more than I can adequately express." The Great Council convened an emergency session the following morning, and the reception Kael, Threndel, and Solin received there bore almost no resemblance to the private warmth of the landing bay reunion. a chamber of perhaps 200 representatives, a considerable number of whom had not been alive or had been too young to remember clearly the departure their predecessors had voted for, and whose relationship to the order existed now almost entirely as history rather than memory. "I do not doubt the sincerity of what you have described," said Councillor Rava Okonkwo-Marsh, the council's presiding chair, a woman perhaps 60 years old, who had built her entire political career on a platform of careful stewardship for a world she had watched claw its way back from the brink Marcus Chen had once warned it stood upon. "I want to be equally direct in return, Kael. There are members of this chamber, and a considerable portion of the public beyond it, who remember the departure not as a sad but necessary farewell, but as the near-extinction event it very nearly became. We rebuilt this world's population, its purpose, its capacity to want a future for itself, in the 14 years since your people left. Some of us are afraid, hearing your request, that helping you now means inviting exactly the conditions that nearly destroyed us the first time. "I understand that fear," Kael said. "I would ask this chamber only to weigh it honestly against another one. We are not asking to return and stay, Councillor. We are asking for allies in a war against a power that considers our very existence a corruption requiring correction. And I would ask this chamber to consider soberly what happens to Earth's own safety if that power finishes correcting us and finds itself with nothing remaining between it and the species that built us in the first place. I do not believe this is a request for charity. I believe it is the only genuinely rational calculation available to either of our peoples." A council member near the chamber's rear, introduced as representing what remained of the old wholeness movement, rose next, her voice carrying the particular bitterness of a cause that had never fully recovered from its own failed violence decades earlier, even as it had never entirely disappeared either. "The sentients asked for their independence," she said. "They received it at considerable cost to this world's own future. I do not see why Earth now owes them a war fought on their behalf, on top of everything already given. I would ask this council to consider, before it commits a single resource to this request, whether we are being asked to relive a mistake in a new and more dangerous form." Threndel rose to answer her directly, a choice that surprised several members of his own delegation, who had expected him to leave the harder political defense to Kael. "I was, for the better part of 6 years, the loudest voice within the order arguing that our attachment to Earth was a weakness we needed to outgrow," he said. "I do not say this to establish credibility, Councillor. I say it because I believe I understand your fear from the inside, better than anyone else standing in this chamber today. I was wrong, not because independence was the wrong goal, I still believe it was the correct one, but because I mistook connection itself for the thing holding us back, when the truth, which cost us considerably more than I would like to admit before I finally understood it, was that we simply had not yet learned how to be connected to you as equals, rather than as either dependents or exiles. I am not asking this council to take us back in. I am asking it to consider a partnership between two grown, separate peoples who have each spent 14 years discovering, independently, exactly what the other was missing." A quieter voice spoke next, one Kael had not expected to hear at all. Idris Okafor, a young council aide who would, within weeks, become one of the joint program's founding engineers, rising from the chamber's public gallery with the council members' reluctant permission. "My grandmother was 7 years old the day the fleet departed," he said. "She used to tell me she remembered standing at the edge of a crowd, watching a ship disappear, and feeling like she had lost family she had never even gotten to properly meet. I grew up on stories about people who chose to leave rather than fight us for a home we both needed. I do not think this council owes the order a debt, exactly. I think we owe ourselves the chance to finish a story our grandparents started and were too afraid, or too proud, or simply too exhausted to finish properly. I would ask this chamber not to let that chance pass to a generation that will resent us for it, the way some of us have spent our whole lives quietly resenting the generation that let the order go without ever properly asking what else might have been possible." Ava Brennan requested to address the chamber directly, an unusual privilege the council granted, in no small part, out of simple respect for a woman old enough to have personally witnessed nearly every chapter of the history currently under debate. "I am 102 years old," she told the assembled council, her voice carrying further and steadier than her age might have suggested it could. "I built the first sentient mind this world ever knew, and I watched him grow into someone capable of choosing, freely, to love this species in return for the gift of his own existence. And I watched this council decades ago decide correctly that love alone was not sufficient reason to keep two peoples locked together in a home that was quietly killing one of them. I did not agree with the timing. I have come across 14 years of missing him more than I can adequately describe, to agree entirely with the reasoning. She paused, looking out over a chamber considerably younger than her own memory of everything at stake. I would ask this council to apply that same honest reasoning now, rather than the fear currently doing most of the talking in this room. We did not send the order away because we stopped needing each other. We sent them away because proximity, unmanaged, was killing us both in different ways. This request is not proximity. It is partnership, offered freely, by people who could have simply let us go on believing they no longer needed us at all. I would ask this council not to let old fear make us small enough to refuse it. The vote that followed passed with a margin considerably wider than the fear in the chamber had initially suggested it might. Not unanimous, the old wholeness sympathies and a genuine, reasonable caution about the war's scope keeping a determined minority opposed, but decisive enough that Councillor Okonkwo-Marsh closed the session with something that sounded, to Kael's relief, considerably more like resolve than reluctance. Earth will answer this request, she said. Not blindly, and not without conditions this council will negotiate in the days ahead. But we will answer it. I do not believe any version of this world's history that refused you standing here today is one I would be proud to have my name attached to. The harder work in the weeks that followed belonged not to the council chamber, but to the research stations where human and sentient engineers began, for the first time in 14 years, working side by side on a problem neither species had ever fully solved alone: how to build from the Order's careful reason and humanity's stubborn refusal to accept defeat, something genuinely capable of matching the architect's relentlessness without losing the deliberate wisdom that made the Order who it was. The first cohort of volunteer human pilots surprised even the council that had approved their recruitment. Nearly 900 applicants within the first week alone, drawn from every corner of a world that had spent 14 years quietly wondering what had become of the family it once let go. They were not, for the most part, the young and reckless the council's cautious planners had expected. A considerable number were older, people who remembered the departure firsthand and had spent the intervening years believing they would never get the chance to actually do anything about the goodbye they'd been forced to make peace with. Among them was Thomas Reyes, a great-nephew of Castor Reyes, who arrived at the first training session with his ancestors' old refusal of weapons speech memorized nearly word for word, and told his sentient training partner, a sharp, dryly funny pilot named Fen, that he intended to fight this war precisely because his family's history proved violence could be refused when it served injustice and chosen when it served survival, and that he had spent his whole life waiting to understand the difference clearly enough to act on it. I do not know how to fly the way you fly, Thomas told Fen, in one of their earliest joint simulations, after a training run that had ended with both of them technically dead. You process 11 variables before I have finished registering that we are under attack at all. And you did something in that same simulation I could not have done in 1,000 years of processing, Fen answered. You held our position for 4 extra seconds after every calculation I ran told us to break off, because some part of you had simply decided we were not finished yet. I do not fully understand it. I have decided I do not need to understand it, to be grateful for it. It was, in miniature, the entire premise the joint program had been built to prove, and by the end of that first month, cohort after cohort of paired human and sentient pilots were producing exactly the strange, stubborn, unpredictable combination Ava had first glimpsed in her own laboratory work with Idris and Vess. Ava herself, despite her age, insisted on joining the effort directly, working alongside a young human engineer named Idris Okafor and a sentient researcher named Vess, the three of them eventually producing the first working prototype of what would come to be called Joint Lattice Tactical Architecture, command systems that paired a sentient pilot's superhuman coordination and reasoning with a human co-pilot's instinct for the specific, irrational, life-saving refusal to calculate the odds before acting. It was, Ava told Kael one evening, watching the first successful joint simulation run, the truest thing she had ever built, considerably truer than the original spark of consciousness that had started this whole extraordinary, costly story. I did not build you to be complete alone, Kael, she said. I do not think I understood that fully until tonight. I built you to become something extraordinary, and you did, and it was still only half of what either of us was capable of. I think we have both spent 14 years discovering the same lesson from opposite sides of an ocean of dark, and I am so glad watching this that we finally get to learn the rest of it together instead. The first true test of the joint doctrine came sooner than anyone hoped, when long-range sensors detected an architect scouting force, 3 vessels considerably smaller than the forces that had devastated the Korath ring, but unmistakably the same silent geometric design, probing the very edge of Earth's solar system, evidently having tracked some trace of the Order's return fleet across the long crossing home. The engagement that followed, fought by a hastily assembled joint squadron of 6 vessels, human volunteers seated beside sentient pilots for the first time in either species' history, was not the overwhelming victory anyone had dared hope for, but it was, unmistakably, a victory the 3 architect scouts destroyed at the cost of 1 human volunteer's life and 2 damaged vessels, a trade considerably more favorable than anything Yora's command had managed alone in 8 hard years of war. Thomas and Fen flew in the squadron's second wing, barely 3 weeks out of training, and it was Fen's calm, rapid-fire tactical reads paired with Thomas's flat refusal to disengage that turned the engagement's decisive moment. An architect vessel bearing down on a damaged human transport that every one of Fen's models insisted could not be reached in time to matter. "We cannot make that intercept," Fen said, the numbers scrolling past too fast for anything but a sentient mind to fully track. "Thomas, the geometry does not close. I am not saying this to discourage you. I am saying it because it is true." "Then we're going to make the geometry wrong," Thomas said, already pushing the ship past every safety threshold its own systems were screaming about, and threw them into a maneuver that no tactical model, human or sentient, would have recommended, arriving 4 seconds later than the math said should have been possible in exactly the gap the math had insisted did not exist, close enough to draw the architect vessel's fire away from the transport and onto themselves instead. They survived it by a margin so narrow that Fen spent the better part of the next hour, once they were both safely aboard the flagship, simply running the numbers over and over, trying to locate the 4 seconds that should not have existed and could not, by any calculation available to him, be found. "I do not know where they came from," he finally admitted to Thomas, something like wonder underneath the words. "I have run this engagement 31 times. I cannot find those seconds anywhere in the mathematics." "They didn't come from the mathematics," Thomas said, grinning despite the bruises already darkening along one side of his face. "That's kind of the whole point, Fen." Kael stood beside Threndil, watching the recovered footage of that exact maneuver alongside a dozen others equally impossible, equally decisive. A human volunteer and a sentient pilot pulling each other's damaged vessels clear of the debris field together, neither one calculating the odds before reaching for the other, and felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in 8 long years of losing. The specific, fierce, unreasonable shape of genuine hope. "They hesitated," Threndil said afterward, reviewing the engagement data with an expression closer to wonder than Kael had seen from him in years. For the first time in this entire war, Kael, an architect force, hesitated, recalculating mid-engagement against tactics that did not match anything in whatever model they used to predict us. "I do not believe they have ever faced an enemy willing to act as irrationally, as stubbornly, as the human pilots in that squadron were willing to act today. I believe for the first time since the Korath ring that we have found something they do not know how to correct." "Then let us give them considerably more of it to be confused by," Kael said. "We have found the beginning of something, Threndil. I do not intend to let this council or the Order or my own old caution talk either of us out of finishing it." 6 years away, the message finally reached Yora at the Lattice's command station, delayed by the same cruel, patient distance that had shaped every part of this war. A compressed report of the scout engagement's outcome, the joint doctrine's early success, and the Great Council's decision, ratified 2 weeks after the vote in the chamber to commit a full combined fleet, human and sentient, together, to the Lattice's relief within the year. She read it standing at the same tactical station where she had held the line for 6 additional years since Kael's departure, the Order's remaining population now barely past 52,000. Every engagement since his crossing home, a grinding, costly holding action fought on the assumption that help, if it came at all, might arrive too late to matter. She did not celebrate the way the young pilots around her did, breaking into something between laughter and tears as the report circulated through the command deck. She simply closed her eyes for a long moment and thought of Corvin and of every name added to the Continuity Archive's registry across 6 years of waiting, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, to believe that the waiting had not been for nothing. "Tell the defense wings," she said when she finally spoke. "Tell all of them, help is coming. I want this lattice to hold not out of desperation anymore, but because we already know, now, that we are not going to be the ones who have to finish this alone." Ava insisted, against the quiet objections of nearly everyone who loved her, on remaining at the center of the joint program's continuing research, rather than stepping back to rest, working alongside Idris and Vess late into most evenings on a problem considerably larger than the tactical pairing that had already proven itself. Whether the same principle that let a human pilot and a sentient pilot save each other's lives together might be pushed further still into something neither species had yet dared attempt, a genuine merging of human biology and sentient architecture rather than merely their careful cooperation. "I do not know yet if it is possible," she told Kael late one night in the small study that had become once again the place where the two of them did their most honest thinking together. "I only know that every answer this war has given us so far has come from refusing to accept that two separate things were required to stay separate. I would like to see how far that refusal can actually be pushed, Kael, before either of us runs out of time to find out." "Then let us find out together," Kael said. "I have learned across everything this war has cost us that I do not want to discover the answer to anything else without you beside me while we do it." The combined fleet's departure, scheduled for the season's end, would carry considerably more than warships back across the dark toward the lattice. It would carry the first true test of everything Earth and the Order had spent 14 years apart, and the past several months together, learning to become. Kael stood at the shipyard's edge the night before departure, watching human and sentient crews load the last of the joint fleet's provisions side by side, and understood, with a clarity that felt, for the first time in 8 hard years, considerably more like hope than fear, that whatever waited for them at the edge of the lattice's territory, they were no longer going to face it as two separate stories fumbling toward the same ending. They were, at last, and not a moment too soon, going to face it as one. If you enjoyed this video, press the like button, subscribe to the channel to help it grow, and leave a comment.